내 차가 더러워질까봐 우리나라에 버렸습니다. 내 집에 냄새가 날까봐 우리나라에 버렸습니다. 내 배낭이 무거워질까봐 우리나라에 버렸습니다. 내 돈 드는 게 아까워 우리나라에 버렸습니다.
당신은 부끄럽지 않게 대한민국을 외칠 수 있습니까? 공익광고협의회.
In the first half of the 20th century, the dream of flight created some of the most extraordinary structures the world has ever seen. Before the first airplane took off, rigid airships offered the possibility of mass air travel. And a small band of visionaries was planning the construction of the biggest aircraft ever built. They would form the world's first airline, carry out the first aerial bombardment of foreign cities. Germany envisaged an empire linked by a fleet of these silent giants. And for a while, it seemed that the airship was poised to conquer the skies. Now, our investigators are going to explore this forgotten era and examine the world of the airship builders. They'll travel to the place where the first prototype flew. They'll uncover the ingenious technology which made construction on this scale possible. They'll enter the U.S. Navy's blimp barns, wooden buildings so large that they have their own microclimate.
Just how big is this place?
And they'll reveal the vital but little-known role that airships played in World War II. This is the lost world of the age of airships. In the last decade of the 19th century, few people had even dreamed of long-distance air travel. The airplane was not yet a practical reality. The only real means of getting aloft were hot air balloons, and being unsteerable, they were little more than a novelty. Still, a few visionaries believed that they did see a way to conquer the skies, using the improbable giant airships called Zeppelins. Still the largest aircraft ever flown, they remain one of the most striking creations in the history of flight. For a brief period, they represented the cutting edge of aerospace technology. It ended in spectacular disaster. Now, our investigators want to find out more about the world of the airships. What they will reveal is a lost future, a vision that never came to pass. Eleanor Herman is an author and historian. She wants to use her skills to build a picture of this forgotten era.
To fly in something like this, it must have been as if they had suddenly sprouted wings.
David Bradshaw is an industrial engineer with a passion for aviation history. He wants to understand the evolution of these monsters of the sky and the ingenuity that went into their construction.
The first thing I noticed, there's no steering wheel. I feel very comfortable up here.
The airship story starts here on Lake Constance on the German, Swiss, and Austrian border. This was home to the man whose name was to become synonymous with the airship, Count Ferdinand von Zeppelin. Von Zeppelin risked everything to pursue his dream of lighter-than-air flight, creating craft that could travel the globe and win wars. Eleanor needs to find out where the Count's vision of air travel came from and how he turned it into a reality. She visits the Zeppelin Museum and meets curator Jürgen Bleibler.
So years before the Wright brothers launched their first airplane, Count von Zeppelin had this dream of airships, and it became an obsession for him. How did it start?
Count Zeppelin took part in a balloon flight in 1866. It would certainly have influenced him a lot. He was fascinated by all aspects of flight. He recognized the potential for both military and civil aviation.
He plowed much of his own money into airship development, but most thought his ideas were crazy.
Sehr einsam war mit seinen Visionen.
You have to realize that at the end of the 19th century, the idea of worldwide civilian air travel and long-distance military flights was mad.
But Count Zeppelin would be proved right. By the outbreak of World War I in 1914, the Zeppelin fleet would have formed the world's first airline and transported 40,000 people. At the NT Zeppelin factory in Germany, where modern airships are still built today, Eleanor meets up with Zeppelin historian John Proven. She wants to know what a Zeppelin actually is.
Well, the original concept of Count Zeppelin was to build like a locomotive with wagons to make a train in the air. That idea wouldn't have worked at all, and thank God he didn't even try it. The original shape was like a long cigar for quite a number of years. During the course of the First World War, they changed over to a very aerodynamical shape, very much like the airships we have today.
Count Zeppelin's dream of fast, global mass transportation spawned a huge industry across Germany geared to creating parts for the airships.
Probably the most unique part of the early airships was the gas bags. They were made of the small intestines of a cow. They had in Berlin 16,000 women working in a factory doing nothing other than cleaning the small intestines of cows, because you needed approximately 500,000 cows to provide enough material for the gas cells for one airship.
These gas cells were filled with hydrogen, a highly inflammable lighter-than-air gas that got the ships off the ground. The bigger the gas bags, the greater the lift. So airships grew in size, as did the hangars they were built and stored in. The Count was a rich man, but the project swallowed everything he had. His hunt for ways to cut costs led to some very creative thinking.
This is where Count Zeppelin built his first airship and his first airship shed, out in the middle of the lake.
In the middle of the lake? How on earth did he do that?
You have to consider that the first airship shed that the Count built, he paid for with his own money. That first shed cost him 65,000 marks. That was a lot of money. But he couldn't afford the ground. So this was for him the least expensive means of finding a piece of property.
The Count also realized that getting these vast airships out of the hangars would be difficult if the wind conditions were anything but ideal. He came up with a rather elegant solution. The floating shed would rotate as the wind direction changed.
It enabled him to take his airship in and out irregardless of the wind direction. That would have been a major problem for him had he built his airship shed on the ground.
So they would turn the entire building around based on wind direction.
The floating factory turned automatically. It was anchored at one end, so the wind would pivot the entire shed, and the airship would always be facing the right direction for takeoff. Then, once the shed was facing the right way, the hangar floor would be pulled out with the airship on top. It opened up like a matchbox. The airship was attached to the floor, and a tugboat would pull the entire platform free, ready for takeoff. It was the start of something extraordinary. In the space of 20 years, Count von Zeppelin personally took the airship from an experimental concept to a practical working reality. It was the pride of Germany. Over the next decade, he developed ever more luxurious craft. The future of the Zeppelin was bright. Its fortunes would peak and then fall with the largest aircraft ever built, the Hindenburg. Our investigators are rebuilding the world that produced the largest flying machines ever built. Airships. Historian Eleanor Herman is in Germany and engineer David Bradshaw is in the United States. They have discovered that the great airships of the past were the work of a small band of visionaries, most famously Count Ferdinand von Zeppelin. They've seen how he developed a floating factory to build his early craft. As the age of long-distance travel dawned, airships brought unparalleled luxury to the skies. In 1928, the Graf Zeppelin made a non-stop flight from Germany to the United States. It was the world's first intercontinental airliner. The passengers traveled in style with private cabins, gourmet food, and a luxury dining room from which they enjoyed breathtaking views. In New York City, there were even plans to dock airships to the top of the Empire State Building. The rise of the Zeppelin seemed unstoppable. Eleanor visits NT Zeppelin, the successor to Count von Zeppelin's company, where Zeppelins are still made today. Here, she meets expert John Provin.
I think it must have been completely amazing for people 100 years ago, most of whom had never gone up in a plane, to go up in a Zeppelin. It must have been as if they had suddenly sprouted wings.
For the first time in history, you could see the world below you. It was the Concorde of the day. This was the fastest means of crossing the ocean. It took you 2.5 days to get to North America versus a ship that took 10 days. And in a luxury that has never been compared since.
By 1936, the Graf Zeppelin was superseded by the Hindenburg. It was 804 feet long. No bigger aircraft has ever been built. People were astonished to see a ship just 78 feet shorter than the Titanic floating above their heads. It was the most sophisticated airship built by the Zeppelin Company and the pride of the Third Reich. Where earlier models had crammed passengers into a gondola, the Hindenburg used part of its massive balloon structure to enclose passenger cabins on 2 decks. In a scale model of the Hindenburg accommodation at the Zeppelin Museum, Eleanor gets a sense of what travel on the airship was like.
A one-way ticket on the Hindenburg cost as much as a brand new car in the United States. And a round-trip ticket was the price of an average American house. For that amount of money, wealthy passengers expected comfort and luxury. It's certainly far more comfortable even than a first-class transatlantic flight today.
Compared to other forms of transport available at the time, the Hindenburg was vastly superior. A long-distance flight by plane was something of an endurance test.
To fully appreciate the luxury of airships like the Hindenburg, I think we should compare them to the airplanes of the time. Upon boarding, passengers were handed earplugs because the roar of the engines was absolutely deafening. They sat in rickety wicker chairs bolted to the floor, which vibrated violently. And the first flight attendants were actually registered nurses on hand to hold vomit cups in front of the passengers.
By contrast, a flight on the Hindenburg was like being in a 5-star hotel. A luxury liner, it had a dining room and lounge, both equipped with lightweight aluminum furniture in the latest Bauhaus style. Not only was this cutting-edge technology, it was the height of fashion. And after dining, guests could retire to the smoking room on an airship filled with highly inflammable hydrogen.
Sounds crazy. There was only one lighter, one electric lighter here on the side. And the way they did this is there was more air pressure inside the room. So hydrogen would never be able to leak into the room. It was always oxygen and air exiting the room.
Smoking was prohibited everywhere else. Passengers were even searched for matches on boarding the vessel. This made a lot of sense, considering the ship held 16 huge gas bags containing 7 million cubic feet of flammable hydrogen. The skeleton of the ship was made of 12 miles of girders, held together by 4 million rivets and braced with 120 miles of piano wire. The entire ship was encased in 40 acres of fabric. This giant could stay afloat because of the hydrogen within its gas bags. Hydrogen becomes dangerous when it mixes with air, and elaborate safety features were designed to minimize the risk of fire. They would prevent any accidental leaks. Now, engineer David Bradshaw wants to find out more about how these systems worked. He's at Lakehurst Naval Base in New Jersey, an airfield where the Hindenburg docked a number of times. Here, he meets up with historian Rick Zitarosa.
So Rick, why use hydrogen?
It was cheap and it was available. The Germans had been flying with it for over 35 years. In peace and war, they were not the least bit intimidated by its use. It cost them pennies.
How did the captain control this massive amount of hydrogen?
Each separate compartment had a separate gas cell. 14 of the 16 gas cells had both manual and automatic gas valves on them. To valve hydrogen, to bring the ship into trim or to make it heavier, you'd pull a wire here in the control car, and that wire would go back 600-800 feet to the valve location, and the valve would open up.
The hydrogen would then dissipate safely into the atmosphere. It seemed to work. When the Hindenburg went into service in 1936, no hydrogen-related fire accident had ever occurred on a civil Zeppelin flight. And in that first year of service, she flew over 300,000 miles. The golden age of airship travel had arrived. But on May 3, 1937, the Hindenburg left Germany on what would be her last flight. It should have been a routine transatlantic crossing. On May 6th, she arrived in America. Strong headwinds meant it had been a slow flight.
The Hindenburg was already late, and its arrival here at Lakehurst was delayed further by storms. Nevertheless, just after 7 p.m., the Hindenburg made its final approach.
As the airship approached the landing pad and dropped its mooring lines, it hovered at about 300 feet. Then, disaster.
It's crashing terrible. Oh my, get out of the way, please. It's bursting into flames and it's falling on the mooring fast and all the folks between us. This is terrible. This is one of the worst catastrophes in the world. The plane running 400 or 500 feet into the sky, and it's a terrific crash, ladies and gentlemen. The smoke and the flames now, and the frame is crashing to the ground, not quite to the mooring mast. All the humanity and all the...
Over 2,000 spectators and the assembled media watched in horror as the world's most sophisticated aircraft burned. At the final count, 36 passengers and crew were dead. In just 32 seconds, a dream in which Zeppelins would carry thousands around the world was gone.
The media coverage of this event was unprecedented. People in America and indeed around the world saw these images and were horrified. Their reactions were amazing. People ran from theaters when they saw the newsreel coverage.
The destruction of the Hindenburg was a glimpse of catastrophe 20th century style, and it made a permanent impression on the world. Many more had been killed in previous disasters, but this was the first to be captured on film and is an enduring image. But although the accident put an end to the civilian use of airships, the U.S. Navy still believed lighter-than aircraft had a major role to play. But for these craft to be accepted into service, the world had to be convinced that the tragedy of the Hindenburg could never happen again. A radio broadcaster's eyewitness account of the Hindenburg disaster, the airship crashing to flames at Lakehurst, New Jersey, remains one of the most famous broadcasts ever made.
To the ground, not quite to the mooring mast. All the humanity and all the...
It took 32 seconds for the fire to completely consume the Hindenburg and to claim the lives of 36 people. The accident cast into doubt the safety of filling airships with hydrogen. For Germany, this meant the end of the Zeppelin dream. But America would now step in. To understand why, David has returned to Lakehurst Naval Air Station in New Jersey, scene of the Hindenburg disaster. Here, a vast hangar, Hangar Number 1, still stands, built in 1920. Inside, David meets up with Lakehurst historian Rick Zitarosa.
Just how big is this place?
Well, you could fit 6 football fields under this roof at one time. As a matter of fact, when it was completed in 1921, for about 10 years' time, it was the biggest open interior space anywhere in the world. And when the Hindenburg was put in here, as they did twice during the 1936 season, she only fit with 15 inches clearance on each end with the doors closed.
It is vast, 966 feet long, so big it even has its own microclimate. Occasionally, it has even rained inside here. But housing a hydrogen-filled ship like the Hindenburg meant putting extraordinary safety measures in place to minimize the risk of fire.
When the Germans came here with the Graf Zeppelin and the Hindenburg, they were right at home. This was one of the safest hangars in the world for a hydrogen airship. Right from the ventilation hatches and skylights in the ceiling to vent out any stray gas, right down to the asphalt blocks that were used on the floor. 985,000 asphalt blocks designed to minimize the danger of any sparks being struck if a tool were dropped.
Even the lighting system and electrical panels were explosion-proof. But examining the site, David uncovers a gas pipe. It's evidence of the reason why the U.S. could continue working on airships while the Germans floundered in the aftermath of the Hindenburg. The U.S. had helium.
Rick, I've discovered this pipe, this helium inflation pipe. So my assumption is we use this for all our airships.
The first U.S. Navy airships in 1917 flew with hydrogen. All the training balloons, everything flew with hydrogen. In late 1921 and early 1922, there were two incidents that occurred which pretty much steered the course towards a national commitment towards the use of helium in American military airships.
In 1921, 44 British and U.S. servicemen had been killed when the hydrogen-filled R-38 broke up on a test flight in Britain. A year later, the Italian-built Roma hit electric power lines. The ensuing hydrogen explosion killed 33 of the 44 on board. Years before the Hindenburg disaster, great American airships like the Shenandoah, built in 1922, or the Los Angeles, constructed 2 years later, were filled with helium. Like hydrogen, helium is lighter than air. But unlike hydrogen, it's inert. It doesn't burn. In the early 20th century, helium was extracted from the ground in only one place in the world, Texas. And in the race to rearm between the wars, the U.S. kept its helium to itself.
And there was a very, very strong feeling within the heretofore complacent element of the United States government that now began to say maybe it's not such a good idea to give helium to the Germans, because there was some resentment. The Hindenburg was like a flying billboard for National Socialism, parading the swastika over foreign lands, touting the greatness of Germany. People were beginning to resent this by 1937.
After the Hindenburg disaster, Germany could not use hydrogen again. And as the U.S. was the only country with helium reserves, it meant the states had a stranglehold on airship technology. And they were to take airship design in a new direction, creating a smaller, more maneuverable form of craft, the blimp. David wants to see how blimps differ from Zeppelins. Their design has remained virtually unchanged since they were first developed in the early 20th century. He's traveled to Goodyear at Pompano Beach in Florida to see a blimp for himself. And the first thing he does is examine it close up.
This is the skin of the ship. It's firm, it's stable. I feel very comfortable up here. But unlike the Hindenburg, this is not a rigid airship. There's no framing inside. What exactly is inside of this ship?
The only thing that's inside the ship is two airbags, and what it does is it maintains the shape of the airship. The airship is it's basically a balloon. It's not rigid. It relies on the internal pressure to maintain the shape of it.
Zeppelins have an internal skeleton. Blimps don't. Instead, they rely on the pressure of gas inside them for their shape. The gas bag holds the helium and ballonets, air sacs which contain normal air. The helium cancels out some of the weight of the ship, allowing it to stay aloft. Propulsion is provided by air screw engines. To become lighter than air, pilot Marty Chandler needs to regulate the air in the ballonets. Expelling normal heavy air through the air valves makes the craft buoyant, and the blimp begins to rise. As it gets higher, the air pressure falls. This causes helium in the balloon to expand. To maintain pressure, air is taken on, and the blimp becomes neutrally buoyant, neither rising nor falling. Using the elevator wheel, rudder control, and the engine, Marty gets the blimp off the ground.
The first thing I noticed, there's no steering wheel.
No, I steer with my feet. I use the rudder pedals to steer us left and right throughout the air. And then for up and down, I use the elevator wheel on the side. The one thing we don't do is roll the aircraft. We have no ailerons, and there's really no reason for them because we're the heaviest thing attached to the balloon. Therefore, we stay down at the bottom.
Although pilot Marty is surrounded by a bank of electronic equipment, the basic controls of the blimp remain pretty much unchanged. The helium-filled blimps developed by the Americans in the 1930s were controlled in an almost identical way.
Could a pilot from the 30s sit in the chair you're in and fly this airship?
Absolutely. With most of the classes of airship that were flown back there, the adjustment time would be very minimal. We really haven't changed that very much at all.
These blimps would prove more versatile than their rigid-framed predecessors, becoming a little-known but supremely important line of defense in World War II. But the day of the Zeppelin was not yet over. The U.S. Navy was about to attempt a hugely ambitious project, to use massive airships as flying aircraft carriers.
여보, 아버님이...
언제까지 울고만 계시겠습니까? 장래는 현실입니다.
이제 보람상조와 준비하십시오. 18년 전통 전국 300여 개 직영망을 갖춘 보람상조.
연 7천여 건 행사를 진행하는 1급 장례 전문 FD들이 정성껏 모셔드립니다.
10년, 20년 후에도 처음 가격 그대로. 대한민국 1등 상조, 보람상조.
지금 전화하십시오.
154-1008 보람상조.
Had a girth about the size of a pony.
A crocodile shaped like a seal.
Sandra Mansey's picture at Lake Champlain is probably the best.
It's the only way to find Champ is to actually be on the lake.
It has an advanced frame.
On the History Channel. On the History Channel.
Our investigators are uncovering the lost world of the airship. They've reconstructed the floating factories that built the first craft and recreated the golden age of civil airship travel that came to an end with the Hindenburg disaster. And they've discovered that the U.S. was able to continue developing craft because they had natural reserves of helium, a safer alternative to inflammable hydrogen. But whereas Germany had developed long-distance passenger craft, such as the Hindenburg, America was traveling in a different direction: military use. Our investigator, Eleanor Herman, has traveled to Richmond Naval Air Base in Florida to find out more about the U.S. military's plans for airships. Here, she meets up with naval historian Anthony Atwood.
After World War I, did the U.S. War Department see any military applications for airships?
They sure did. The Kaiser's forces during the Great War had raided and bombed London and other places. So the American War Department did see a potential, particularly the Navy.
In 1931, Washington funded the building of two extraordinary naval airships, the Akron and the Macon, to the tune of $8 million. That's over $100 million in today's money. Even in the extraordinary world of lighter-than-air craft, these ships were to be unlike any others. Not only were they the biggest airships ever produced for the U.S. Navy, but they were also the first and only flying hangars.
The plan was that these enormous rigid airships would carry a squadron of aircraft on board, and they would be the eyes of the fleet, that they would travel overhead and in advance of the fleet, scouting out, seeking to find the enemy.
The first of the ships to be built, the USS Akron, had a volume of 6.5 million cubic feet. That's the capacity of 48 Olympic-sized swimming pools. The balloon was 785 feet long, just 20 feet shorter than the Hindenburg. It had 8 engines, providing a range of almost 6,000 nautical miles. It could travel at over 80 miles per hour. But the most impressive thing about this giant craft lay in its hull. An internal room, 75 feet long, 60 feet wide, and 16 feet tall, capable of holding up to 5 fighter planes. A trapeze was used to lower planes beneath the belly of the airship. A skyhook was released, and the plane was on its own, able to carry out aerial reconnaissance. As daredevil as these aerobatics sound, launching from the airship was the easy part. Now, Eleanor's going to take off in a 1940s biplane. She wants to get a feel for what the pilots had to do next. Because once the pilot's mission was over, the plane would return to the airship and in mid-flight dock with the craft above. This was an extraordinary piece of precision flying. The pilot had to match exactly the speed of the airship above him while attempting to hook his plane onto the trapeze.
This plane is traveling at 80 miles an hour. I can't even begin to imagine how it could possibly hook onto a trapeze dangling below an airship.
It seemed a perfect combination. The airship could transport planes great distances from their bases, and the more nimble planes could undertake surveillance at sites where the airship would be vulnerable to attack. Although tests demonstrated the skills of the pilots and the theoretical advantages to these flying hangars, there was an obvious flaw. Just like the ocean-going aircraft carriers they were intended to replicate, they were vulnerable to enemy aircraft. But it wasn't just enemy attack that made airships vulnerable. They had another adversary that would eventually end the dream of flying aircraft carriers: bad weather.
At high altitudes, they did not have the flexibility to withstand the winds, and they had a tendency to crack up and crash.
On April 3rd, 1933, the Akron was lost at sea over the Atlantic Ocean. 73 men died. Only 2 years later, the Macon II was lost off Point Sur, California. The Skyhook program was too ambitious, the massive balloons too fragile. But they had shown the Navy that, used correctly, airships could have a valuable place in warfare. They developed a smaller and more flexible craft, the blimp. David meets up with Richard Van Turen, NASA engineer and historian, to uncover more about the role of blimps in World War II.
When the Navy lost the USS Macon, a Bureau of Aeronautics memorandum issued a request for the so-called K-2 airship.
Airplanes measure flight time in hours, but a blimp can stay aloft for days. It can also hover almost silently. These qualities came into play in the ensuing conflict. It meant that airships could become hunters and seek out an enemy invisible to all other craft. As David finds out, it was ideal for surveillance.
Marty, I can see why the Navy chose blimps to patrol the ocean. You can see everything from here.
We've got miles and miles of clear ocean to see, not only on the surface, but down below us.
Fantastic.
Over 130 of these blimps patrolled the coastal waters of the continental United States, stationed in places like Richmond, Florida. Although few know of the blimps' role, they were to play a vital part in securing the national interest. Only 4 days after the December 1941 attack on Pearl Harbor, Hitler declared war on the United States. Packs of U-boats set out from bases in occupied Europe. Hunting beneath the surface of the Atlantic, they would wreak havoc along the eastern seaboard. The Nazi subs struck with stealth and near impunity. Their target, merchant ships carrying vital supplies for the war in Europe. The Allies knew that they had to beat the Nazi wolf packs or the war would be lost.
The airship is really the submarine's only natural enemy because it works very much like a submarine in our ocean of air.
Just like the submarine, the blimp could travel far from home. It could observe from the air, and thanks to the clever design of its control car, the K-class became a real threat to the German subs. Large plexiglass windows meant that the crew had a 360-degree view of the oceans below. The gondola was crowded with what was then high-tech radar, navigation, and rescue gear. From their vantage point, the crew could watch for U-boats while accompanying shipping convoys. Just having a blimp hovering over a convoy was enough to put the submarines off attacking. The sub-crews knew they would be spotted and then pursued by bombers.
We have uncovered several encounters where blimps attacked submarines. We know from the German side how the U-boat men felt about blimps. Basically, they didn't mess with them.
The U-boat crews had every reason to fear the blimps. On the night of July 18, 1943, K-74 spotted a U-boat off the coast of Miami. Knowing a U.S. freighter and tanker were in the area, the blimp commander decided to attack. As the K-74 approached, it was spotted by the Germans. The blimp released its depth charges, but it was now in range of the U-boat's anti-aircraft guns. With its gas bag burst, it plummeted into the sea. All but one of the crew was rescued the following morning. The men on the U-boat were not so lucky. The blimp's bombs had damaged the sub's quick dive tanks. It attempted to limp back to base on the surface, but was spotted by an RAF bomber and sunk.
Between 1942 and 1945, Richmond blimps were on patrol for 730 consecutive days. That was a record untouched by any other airship squadron. And as a result, successful German U-boat attacks on U.S. convoys dropped from 114 in 1942 down to a mere 8 the following year.
The blimps had a remarkable record in warfare, but no less remarkable was the enormous construction and engineering efforts that enabled them to fly in the first place. Air bases needed to be able to support the blimp squadrons, and hangars had to be built that were large enough to hold a number of airships. The construction project that met this need was the largest of its kind in history. Our investigators are searching for the lost world of airships. They visited the site of the infamous Hindenburg disaster in New Jersey and uncovered the U.S. Navy's K-class blimps, lighter-than-air craft used to hunt Nazi U-boats at the height of the Second World War. Now, Eleanor is in Richmond, Florida, to find out how such a massive operation was possible in wartime. This site, Richmond Naval Air Station, was home to Squadron ZP-21 during the war. 9 other bases across the country had their own squadrons, and 17 vast hangars, or blimp barns, were built to house the sub-hunters. At Richmond, these hangars are long gone, but naval historian Anthony Atwood is able to reveal where they once stood.
These blueprints were drawn up by an architectural firm in Atlanta.
And the hangars were over on this side?
2 hangars here and a 3rd hangar here.
The site was commissioned on September 15, 1942. It was dominated by 3 main hangars, a 2,000-foot diameter landing mat, 8 mooring pads, and a helium plant with its very own rail link. In all, it covered over 2,500 acres.
There were 3,500 sailors in the garrison, and there were 21 blimps, the largest squadron in the Navy.
All that is left of the 3 hangars is this: a 120 feet high concrete doorpost, 2 of these stood at the opening to each hangar. They offer a clue as to the scale of the barns. But in 1942, steel was required for tanks and planes, and none could be spared for buildings. It meant that the barns had to be built from some other material.
They used wood. They were supposed to have been made of girders, but instead they were made of Douglas fir. Oregon supplied lumber for the base here, for hangars all over. The size of these structures was enormous. They were simply the biggest wooden structures that have ever been built.
To make the largest structures ever made from wood, an unprecedented amount of timber would be needed, approximately 2.5 million feet for each hangar, and almost another 5 million for the base itself. Without the hangars, there would be no blimp squadrons, and the shipping convoys would be vulnerable to sub-attack, so getting them up and running quickly was vital.
They used a cookie-cutter approach. One blueprint would fit all sizes. Recruiting officers went to the Goodyear blimp factory in Akron. They assembled the workers, and they simply told them, every male between the ages of 18 and 42, raise your right hand, and they swore them into the service.
Using the information our investigators have gathered, it is now possible to build a picture of how these hangars, the largest ever structures made of wood, looked during the Second World War. The body of the barn was a huge arch, 157 feet high, 257 feet wide, and over 1,000 feet long. These arches were then covered in tongue and groove boards, an area of 7.4 acres. The massive reinforced concrete and wood door frame was supported independently. Each one cost around $2.5 million, the equivalent of around $30 million today. The Richmond base was finished within a year and operational within months. Over the length of the war, the squadron logged over 100,000 hours of flying over nearly 8,000 missions. Together, these barns and the men who served at them made a huge contribution to the U.S. war effort. When the war ended in 1945, demobilization began swiftly. The blimps were deflated and removed from their bases. Personnel were discharged. But now Eleanor wants to know what happened to the hangars. She's met up with historian Michael Hall. He reveals that just 2 weeks after the Japanese surrendered in early September 1945, there were warnings of a hurricane due to hit Miami. Blimps, other aircraft and vehicles needed to be placed under cover, and the hangar seemed the ideal place.
They knew the hurricane was coming. What they did, they brought airplanes from military bases all around the area. So they literally packed these 3 blimp hangars as tight as they could, not only with airplanes, but local citizens brought their cars. The various military bases around the area put all of their valuable items, military trucks and this sort of thing in here. So they were all filled with gasoline. So it was basically a disaster waiting to happen.
25 airships, around 350 airplanes, and 100 more road vehicles were stored across the 3 hangars. The base had been built to withstand winds of 120 miles per hour. But there was no defense against another hazard: fire.
Do they know how the fire started? Was it perhaps a lightning strike?
There would have been maybe some sort of structural member in the roof that got dislodged from the wind, and it would have fallen to the floor. And remember, the floor was full of all these airplanes and blimps, and everything was filled with gasoline. It might have punctured a fuel tank, made a spark. When with the velocity of the wind, as hangar number 3 became engulfed in the fire, it spread to hangar number 1 and 2, which were side by side. And that's where we're standing here, actually on the floor of what was hangar number 1. It was a very short time, all 3 hangars were engulfed in flames.
The 50 sailors that were stationed on watch struggled to get out of the burning buildings. 26 were injured. 1 man lost his life. By morning, only the concrete pillars of the hangars still stood.
It became so hot that it bubbled the moisture from the concrete below us. You see here, the bubbling of the concrete is actually where one of the airplanes stood, and that's where the fires were the hottest because they were filled with this aviation gasoline.
When the storm ended, Richmond's hangars were reduced to ash. Costing $30 million, it was the biggest peacetime loss of federal property on record. Today, this doorpost is all that remains of a brief but exciting period of aviation history. The Richmond blimp barns are just one example of the scale of vision central to the airship story. From the early days of Count von Zeppelin's floating factories, airships pushed the boundaries of technology. The crash of the largest aircraft ever to fly, the Hindenburg, is still an iconic image. And airships played a vital but little-known role in securing victory for the Allies in World War II. Ultimately, these awesome vessels, despite the extraordinary innovations that went with them, were the losers in the transport revolution. And yet, for a time, airships could have been the future of air travel.
History Channel.